right. Looks like it's time. Countdown has reached 0, so let's get started with our Bible class. We are continuing in our study of the topic of forgiveness. And over the course of the weeks, we've studied various aspects of forgiveness. First, we studied the forgiveness that we have, that we receive from God, and how we should respond to that. And now we've switched gears, and we started talking about granting and receiving forgiveness from our fellow man, which, as challenging as it is with God, sometimes it's even harder for us to accept or to grant forgiveness with our fellow man. And so that's what we're going to look at tonight. We started on that on Sunday, but we are going to look, do a little review, and then we're going to get into some more areas. It's very practical, so I hope this class has a lot of discussion, and I'd love to hear your experiences. Before we get into that, I asked Skylar if you would open our class with a word of prayer. Amen. Thanks, Skylar. So just going all the way back to our first class, we talked about the different dimensions of forgiveness. And we spent several weeks on the vertical dimension. That's the relationship we have between us and God. We remember the parable of the unforgiving servant and how we should be motivated to forgive just like the master forgave us. That's a very powerful motivation because the debt we owed our master was enormous. It's too much for us to ever pay back. And so that serves as our motivation, which leads us to the internal. And the internal is forgiving from our heart. It's the idea that we can forgive someone internally and let go of the bitterness and the resentment and those things that seek to kind of drag us down. And there's the horizontal aspect. That's where we rebuke our fellow man who has sinned against us, and that fellow man repents, and it's that aspect of us restoring a relationship. So all these steps really flow into each other. Starts with God to us, and then to our fellow man. Yes, Ryan. Yeah. Right. I absolutely agree. Yes. Forgiveness is something that that God shows us again and again and again. And as we try to live like God, we should be people who forgiveness is just a part of who we are. It's really one of those things that differentiates Christians from the world, is the quality and the quantity of our forgiveness. So yeah, good point. All right, so we talked about this last week, this idea of the internal forgiveness. Hebrews 12, I think, explains it really well. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. There's a danger in having bitterness in our hearts. It's like a root, it's like a weed. It's a weed that you got to pull up by the roots, or else it keeps springing back up in your life. And bitterness is like that. Bitterness is something, if you don't deal with it, it's going to rule you, and it's going to distort your relationships with other people. It's going to distort your view of yourself. You think about if you hold bitterness against someone that's It's like saying to them, you don't deserve my grace. And to have that kind of attitude, it distorts your view of yourself, thinking that you're morally superior or that you don't need to grant grace to others because you feel like you're someone that's better. And so this bitterness is something that we have to deal with. And a lot of times when the world talks about forgiveness, and you maybe you see a psychologist about some relationship problems you're having, and they encourage you to forgive, they're talking about the internal and not getting to the external, the actually mending the relationship. They want you to deal with your feelings, and which is good and which the Bible teaches, but there's much more to it than that. But anyway, just to bring us to where we are, we talked last week about, okay, so we want to get rid of this bitterness. We want to get rid of the resentment in our heart. How do we do it? Lots of great ideas. Just a few things I want to add to the discussion that we had last week. Some things I think might help. Try to identify with the person who's wronged you. That's hard to do. That's really hard to do. Have you ever been that person before? Have you hurt someone else? I think we've all done that in many ways. So if we can identify with the person who's wronged you, I think it helps us to show mercy and grace to others. Also, just having those tender feelings to other people. We talked about the idea of mercy, and especially the Old Testament word for mercy is like the tender feeling a parent has for a newborn child. Just think about those kind of feelings. And you know what does a newborn child do? Well, they don't do you a lot of favors. They wake you up in the middle of the night, they cry, they make dirty diapers for you. They're not doing you a lot of good. But why do you tolerate that? It's because of the feelings, the tender feelings you have for that baby. And we talked about this on Sunday. Be humble. Don't see yourself as superior. Everybody has sinned. And just remembering that and remembering God's forgiveness of us should help motivate us to internally forgive. All right, so here's a new question that we haven't got to yet. We talked about the idea of forgiveness in the context of the idea of debt, right? So the parable of the unforgiving servant was about a master forgiving a debt. And we said a debt is a good analogy. This is an analogy Jesus used multiple times to describe the idea of sin. And so we talked about the idea of when someone owes you something, forgiving that debt. Like, for example, if someone broke my window in my house, and those windows are so expensive, I'd be pretty upset, but I would forgive. I'd forgive and say, okay, you don't owe me a new window. I don't need you to cut me a check for a new window. I forgive you. But the cost doesn't go away, right? I then, by forgiving, absorb that cost, whether it be I have hot or cold air coming in my house, making it uncomfortable for me, or I just shell out the money myself to buy a replacement window. So in the context of internally forgiving, there is a cost there. So what happens to the cost? And we talk about a cost in terms of forgiveness, especially internally, it's an emotional cost. So what happens to the cost when we internally forgive someone? What was that, Jimmy? Okay, Jesus took that on but when we're dealing, if you did me wrong, Jimmy, and you hurt me deeply, it made me very upset, but I forgive you. What happens to me? I'm paying the cost, right? I have to absorb some of that cost. And it comes through, emotions, right? It comes through the feelings that I have to overcome, right? Because I don't want Jimmy to feel the cost. When I forgive Jimmy, the cost of that hurt is not his. The cost is mine. It becomes mine. And it's something that, it's not something that just is paid once, right? Well, someone did me wrong and I forgave them, and I just don't feel anything anymore. It's done, right? It's a cost that's paid sometimes over a long period of time. For example, if there's if you have a relationship breakup, someone breaks up with you, and you're trying to get over that hurt, and then you see that person, dating someone else. Well, every time you see that, it kind of stings a little bit, right? You have to bear with those kind of pains and those heartaches. Well, that's what you have to do when you internally forgive someone. Is you pay those costs over time, and it's not easy. It's very hard, and that's what I think makes forgiveness a challenge. But sometimes we're not very good at doing that. Sometimes we don't want to just absorb the cost ourselves, and we have little sneaky ways of extracting payment from the other person. So, what are some sneaky ways we extract payment from the sinner? Let me give you an example. If someone hurts me, I can just be very cold to that person. I can just, or, for all the millennials out there like me, I barely made the cut for millennial, by the way, so. They say, we call it ghosting, right? People, if that person texts you, I'm not going to text back. I'm just gonna ignore. You're dead to me. I think Todd brought it up last time. It's just like treating that person in a way that's very cold. That's one way that maybe we say, okay, we forgive you. We're not asking for you to do penance or something, but I'm extracting a little bit of penance myself just by the way I treat you. So, okay, give it that example. What do you think? What are some other ways that we can sneakily extract these little debt payments from others? I want some examples, yeah. Okay. Okay. Doing things, maybe not doing kind works, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's a good example. What else? I heard some, Mom. Okay. Okay, so bringing other people in that don't need to know, right? And you might think, oh, I'm just warning them. I'm just trying to warn you about this person over here. But in reality, maybe we have another motive that we want to be kind of gossipy, right? So that's another way. Yeah, Ryan. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, and I think you make a good point. We can never really truly pay the debt of sin in any form or fashion, but there is sort of our feelings of to be quite honest, revenge, right, get the better of us sometimes. And this is when we try to have it both ways. We try to forgive, and we try to have a little bit of, we call it justice or revenge at the same time. Yeah, I mean, just finger quotes around a lot of this stuff, but I don't want to sprain my fingers. Yeah. Yes, yeah. Any other thoughts? Yes. Exactly. Yes, exactly. Remember how I forgave you, or maybe like a feeling of, remember I forgave you this. Now you owe me. You owe me because I forgave you. Which that's that's not forgiveness, right? But keeping score, right? I heard something else. Somebody. Baggage. Okay. Yeah. And I think related to that, it's like bringing it up over and over again, or maybe making cutting remarks. If someone broke my window, I'll be like, oh yeah, I can trust you. You broke my window last week, things like that. Those kind of things, they're like that root of bitterness that just keeps springing back up, and it's hard for us to deal with it. But the effort and the cost of paying down these debts is every time we feel like we want to do something like that, we don't do it. That's how we internally pay that debt ourselves and take that on. It's when we have these feelings, we can't act on them. We got to try to get rid of these feelings altogether. I saw Evan and then Debbie. Yeah. Yeah. These little cutting remarks, they sting. They sting, and it's a constant reminder. We need to try to avoid that. Debbie. Yes. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and we're going to get into that, like Romans chapter 12, here in just a minute, which really drives that point home. So no, these are all good. All bad things for us to do, but like good examples of ways that we try to forgive, or we say we forgive, but we just haven't got all the way there. Next question is another tough one. It's like, do we have to feel it before you grant it? When I'm talking about forgiveness, like someone hurts me and they ask me for forgiveness, and I know I'm supposed to internally forgive, but I'm just not feeling it. Like I'm still angry. Can I grant forgiveness at that point? Skylar? You can start? Yeah. 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 Right. Right. Starting point. Good. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
you again.
Yeah.
Blah 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 blah. All the things that we would treat people that way. He doesn't. He's like he puts the robe on him. I think he puts the ring on him. He welcomes him back into the home. Let's have a party.
Yeah.
Look at the examples of forgiveness you see from God in the Old Testament. When Israel is at their worst,
Yeah.
they're worshiping all these idols. They're sacrificing their children to these idols. And God's message to them is always just like, even now, if you would repent, I would forgive you.
Mm-hmm.
You'll be lying again.
Right.
That's perfect forgiveness.
Yeah.
I don't know, like, how do I stack up
Yeah.
against that? How does Skylar stack up against that? I don't know, but the model of perfect forgiveness is before us.
Right. No, we are definitely trying to. We're aiming for the forgiveness that God forgave us with. I think that's the lesson of the unforgiving servant. But you're right, we fall short a lot of times, and sometimes our feelings can't be changed immediately, right? And when we say we forgive someone, sometimes it's like as Skylar said, it's a start, and it's merely an act of will, and it's a promise that we make to the sinner. It's a promise we make that we aren't going to make you pay this debt. Again, I go back to Mark 11. We talked about this in our intro. Whenever you stand praying, forgive. If you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may forgive you your trespass. So here we see, in the middle of a prayer, forgive. It's not saying, well, wait until you get all your emotions worked out. Saying, and in that moment, you need to forgive. And that's an act of will that we can do. And it's a promise that we are going to be working on ourselves to put that into our emotions. It's a practice before it's a feeling. So, what can help us change our feelings, right? That's hard to do. That's really hard to do. I don't know, at least for me, like I feel the way I feel, and getting you guys to change me, that's going to be tough. How do we change our feelings, Todd?
I think there's a presupposition as we're talking about forgiveness. We ourselves are the judge and jury
Mm-hmm.
of what is that person sinned against us. So we're already potentially faulty in our judgment.
Yeah.
So the way I approach things is when I'm trying to work through things, understand things, decide things, I have to leave a percentage out there that I'm wrong.
Okay.
And I'm misinterpreting the whole thing.
Yeah.
And so when I do that, knowing that I could be wrong, it makes it much easier for me to forgive somebody else because I could have missed something altogether.
Right.
So I just counted up to Matt,
Yeah.
And my heart never gets upset with people that way because I just think this is life and life happens.
Right.
And I could be wrong, and everybody makes a mistake, and I'll make a mistake, fall apart from me, I've got to forgive others. So grace runs freely.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not at the top of your list and you don't let it run freely, you start withholding it, you get into a lot of trouble.
Right. There's a humility that we all have to have, and an acknowledgement that it could be me. It could be me. Yes, Jimmy.
I think one important thing is that God loves all of us
Mm-hmm.
equally. He loves us individually. And I've sinned against, but he loves me too. He's forgiven me. He certainly expects me to forgive this other individuals. As Todd said, who are we to hold something against somebody else?
Right.
So much has been forgiven of us.
Right. Yes, it's just to remind ourselves and stay connected to the God's for forgiveness of us. Absolutely. Oh yeah, Skylar. Mm-hmm. Right.
But I know that over time you can become way less reactive to your feelings, and you can start to make them less impactful. And then when you start to understand why you're having feelings, then your heart will change towards people. And so like where you might react angrily to someone, when you recognize that, you're like, oh man, okay, I'm angry towards my brother. Why? And then you start to understand why you're angry towards your brother, because you've examined yourself. And then
Right.
you change that.
Yeah.
You go and you change the reason why, because I feel superior, right? Why do I feel superior? Because I'm a prideful jerk, And so you start to change that, and then all of a sudden you stop becoming angry at your brother because you've humbled yourself and changed your own opinion of yourself.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to take a step out of ourselves because we kind of we get wrapped up in ourselves, and it's hard to take a step back and kind of examine ourselves rationally and see our emotions for what they are. Yeah, thank you for that comment, Skylar. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
But then later on in Deuteronomy, it says, I'm not bringing you in the land because you're righteous. You are a stubborn people.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's
Yeah.
still that acknowledgement, but he relented from the disaster.
Right.
And there Moses is asking him to remember the promises and remember Abraham. Right. There are times when God says, I'm being patient with you because of my relationship with Abraham. Right. But then much, much later, with Amos, for example, Amos asked God to remember all of his history with those people.
Yeah.
Particularly with Jacob. He said, how's Jacob going to stand? And God says, I'm not going to do it. And so sometimes maybe it's reminding ourselves of what this person was to his Lord.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Remember the Moses and the prophets. Anyone who intercede for Israel is like, remember your steadfast love, and we have to tap into that as well. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so maybe at first you don't have the feelings, and you make a promise that you will forgive. And I think it goes back to kind of what Debbie said before. You put some things into practice that will help you with your feelings, right? You do good to the person who's hurt you. That's going to change the way you see that person. Do something good for your enemies and see how it changes you. And I think that's what Romans chapter 12, verses 14 through 21 teaches. Let's turn there. This was Noah's sermon on Sunday was about Romans chapter 12, which I was kind of glad that we didn't get to this in class last week because you'd probably get tired of Romans chapter 12. Never, that's true. But this will be a good reminder. Romans chapter 12, verses 14 through 21. Just really great verses that kind of teach us about how we can seek the good of the sinner and see what that does to us. All right, so Romans chapter 12, verse 14. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So here, like, just so much packed into this, 7 verses right here. And I just love, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So I've read that this word overcome is a military term, means to defeat. So you see 2 possibilities here. You could either be defeated by evil wins, or evil is defeated, and we defeat evil with good. And so I think this is absolutely true of our relationships, in our relationships. We don't want evil to win in our relationships. We don't want evil to win when it comes to sin and forgiveness. Look at how it starts. It says, bless those who persecute you. Now, you want to see how you can change your feelings about someone? Bless them. And I can't think of like a better way to bless someone than to be in constant prayer for them. If you pray for someone, if you pray for the good of someone who's hurt you, I don't see how you can have, bitterness in your heart in that moment. Because you're standing before a God who forgave you. I think that opens you up, that helps you feel compassion to others in that moment. So bless those. Pray for them. Yes? Okay. Mm-hmm. Good. Yes, Ryan.
And I think when we think about forgiveness, as we've discussed, it's essentially not holding people to account for payment for yourself. It does not mean, however, that you have to automatically restore 100% trust in them. The reality is when we deal with sin, we go through these practices of trying to address the sin, see the sin removed, and yes, have 100% fellowship, love, and trust again. That should be restored. But as Christians, we're to be conscientious about such things. And again, if we're not always receptive, our heart's not right.
Yeah, I want to be clear, like, in our studies, I don't want to make it seem like you're at fault if you're not. Internal forgiveness isn't easy and it's not something you can do immediately. Or a restoration of a relationship, is immediate, right? I mean, I think Jared brought up a really good point that you see that kind of quality from God, and that's what we aim for. But for us as fallible, fallen people, it's a struggle, and I think we're going to look at it in the next slide. But we see the apostles basically saying, or the disciples saying to Jesus, "You've asked us to forgive 7 times in a day? Like, this is impossible. Increase our faith. We don't have this kind of faith." And so I don't want to make people feel like it is easy. Because it is a challenge, right? So to your point, yeah, these things take time with us. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought verse 16 up because I think you're right. To live in harmony, we have to follow what it says in the very next sentence. Do not be haughty, right? We've got to humble ourselves. That's going to help us. We talked about that. That's going to help us internally forgive when we don't see ourselves as superior or we don't see others as unforgivable or unworthy of our grace. If we humble ourselves and recognize who we are, people in need of grace, all of us, that's going to help us live in harmony. That's what's going to help empower our ability to forgive. Good. And part of the humility, I think, is where it says in verse 19, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. So it's not our place to be a judge like God is a judge. That's reserved for God. He says, vengeance is mine. So who are we? When we want to be the judge, when we want to be a little tyrant and judge others, we're putting ourselves on a seat that God has reserved for himself. You think about the parable of the unforgiving servant. You see a master becoming a servant and saying, I will pay it for you. But then you see a servant trying to act like a master, trying to act like a king or a judge. What we need to do is recognize our place as servants and not as master or judge. That will also help us be able to let go of the bitterness and resentment. And finally, it says, do good. Seek the good of the sinner. If he's hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. Find opportunity to serve, and in doing so, it'll heap burning coals on his head. Right? I don't think this is like some bizarre way of getting revenge. I don't think that's what it's trying to say. What I think it's trying to say is you're going to get more justice from showing kindness and showing forgiveness than if you had tried to take on God's role as judge yourself. Leave those things up to God and acknowledge that not everything is going to be made right in this life. Not every right is going to be wrong. Even in our relationships, when we forgive others, and if someone else repents, maybe they can't restore. Maybe they can't restore what they had done to you completely. And we have to be okay with that and recognize that vengeance is God's. It's not us. And in the end, God will make those decisions. But God also, we see God as a forgiving God too. So, yes, Jimmy. Yes.
Somebody yet still recognize that they have certain traits that maybe are not what you want in going forward. And that's not the same as holding on against somebody.
Right. Yeah, God does not expect us to be, naive or putting that other person in a position where they might sin again, right? But restoration of relationship seeks to restore as much as is possible. Sometimes we like to make excuses for why we don't restore relationships, so I think I think we need to try to examine ourselves when we do that. Make sure that we are doing it, making every effort to restore a relationship where it's possible. But I don't think if you're in an abusive relationship or something like that, that God expects you to put yourself in harm's way or something like that. Good point. All right, just a few minutes left. I did mention this passage. This is back to Luke 17, which we've already studied in our intro class. Pay attention to yourselves. If your brother sins, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him. If he sins against you 7 times in a day and turns to you 7 times, saying, I repent, you must forgive him. And look at the reaction of the apostles. Okay, he just says this 7 times in a day. Apostle said to the Lord, increase our faith. This is hard to believe. This is so hard to do. And I agree with them. This is hard to do. The Lord said, if you had the faith of like a grain of a mustard seed, you could say this to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it will obey you. So does Jesus say you do need like massive amounts of faith to do this? No. He says you need to have this tiny mustard seed amount of faith. So how is that possible? It's hard, right? So how is it that we just need what tenet of faith do we need to be able to forgive like this? All right, we're running out of time, so I'll just answer the question myself. Look at Colossians 1:19 through 20. For in him, Jesus, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth and heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. So look at the story of Jesus, right? Look at what God did through Jesus to reconcile us to him. If you have that faith, the faith in what God did for us, if you understand that, then I think you can understand how to forgive 7 times in a day. Just a quote from a book I read, it says, take in what Jesus Christ has done, put your little story about what people have done to you into the big story of what he did for you, and you'll have all the power you need to grant forgiveness. So that little mustard seed is just the gospel. If you understand the gospel at all, if you understand the gospel, a mustard seed's worth, you'll understand what it takes to forgive. Doesn't mean it's easy, but you'll have the faith you need to forgive others. All right, that's our class for today. Any comments? Any comments this evening before we close up? Yep, Jared. Mm-hmm.
His repentance and forgiveness was so complete, he was entrusted to be the apostle sent to the Gentiles.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the idea is I think we want to, we seek to trust again, right? And sometimes that does take time. It takes seeing fruits of repentance, but that's our goal of restoring a relationship. All right, thank you, everybody. I think our class time is up. There's the bell. We'll pick up on Sunday.